The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued. Cassette 10, Side 1. Not content, the League turned its thoughts to controlling the trade of the Rhine. Cologne, which had formed a Hansa of its own, was forced into subordination. But farther south, the Hanseatic was stopped by the Rhenish League, formed in 1254 by Cologne, Mainz, Speyer, Worms, Strasbourg, and Basel. Still farther south, Augsburg, Ulm, and Nuremberg handled the trade that came up from Italy. To this day one may see in Venice the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, their depot on the Grand Canal. Regensburg and Vienna stood at the western end of the great Danube artery that took the products of inland Germany through Salonika into the Aegean, or through the Black Sea to Constantinople, Russia, Islam, and the East. So European trade came full circle, and the web of medieval commerce was complete. What sort of men were the merchants who sent their goods along these routes amid the suspicious faces, strange tongues, and jealous creeds of a dozen lands? They came from many peoples and countries, but a great number of them were Syrians, Jews, Armenians, or Greeks. They were seldom such businessmen as we know today, safe and sedentary behind a desk in their own city. Usually they moved with their goods. Often they traveled great distances to buy cheaply where the products they wanted abounded, and returned to sell dear where their goods were rare. Normally they sold, as well as bought, wholesale, en gros, said the French. The English translated en gros into grosser, and used this first form of the word grocer to mean one who sold spices in bulk. Merchants were adventurers, explorers, knights of the caravan, armed with daggers and bribes, ready for highwaymen, pirates, and 1,000 tribulations. The variety of laws and the multiplicity of jurisdictions were perhaps the worst of their harassments, and the progressive formulation of an international law of commerce and navigation was one of their major achievements. If a merchant traveled by land, he was subject to a new court, and perhaps different laws at every feudal domain. If his wares were spilled upon the road, the local lord could claim them. If his ship was stranded, it belonged by the law of wreck to the landlord upon whose shores it fell. A Breton lord boasted that a dangerous rock on his coast was the most precious stone in his crown. For centuries the merchants fought this abuse. In the 12th they began to secure its abrogation. Meanwhile the international Jewish traders had accumulated for their own use a code of mercantile law. These regulations became the foundation of the law merchant of the 11th century. This jus mercatorum grew year by year through the ordinances issued by lords or kings for the protection of merchants or visitors from foreign states. Special courts were established to administer the law merchant, and significantly these courts disregarded such old forms of evidence or trial as torture, duel, or ordeal. As early as the 6th century, in the laws of the Visigoths, foreign merchants had received the right, in disputes affecting only themselves, to be judged by delegates from their own countries. So began that consular system by which a trading nation maintained abroad consuls, or counselors, to protect and aid their nationals. Genoa established such a consulate at Acre in 1180. French cities followed suit in the 12th century. Agreements among nations, even between Christian and Moslem states, for such consular rights were among the best medieval contributions to international law. A measure of maritime law had survived from antiquity. It never ceased among the enlightened merchants of Rhodes, and one of the oldest maritime codes was the Code des Rhodiens of 1167. The Lois d'Oléron were issued at the end of the 12th century by an island off Bordeaux to govern the wine trade, and were adopted by France, Flanders, and England. The Hanseatic League published a detailed code of maritime regulations for its members, precautions to be taken for the safety of passengers and cargo, obligations of rescuer and rescued, duties and wages of captains and crews, and conditions under which a merchant vessel might or should become a man of war. Penalties in these codes were severe, but apparently severity was necessary to establish traditions and habits of nautical discipline and reliability. The Middle Ages disciplined men for 10 centuries, in order that modern men might for 4 centuries be free. 2. The progress of industry. The development of industry kept pace with the expansion of commerce. Wider markets stimulated production, and mounting production nourished trade. Transport progressed least. Most medieval highways were avenues of dirt and dust or mud. No crown or culverts carried water from the road. Holes and pools abounded. Fords were many, bridges few. Burdens were carried on pack mules or horses rather than in carts, which could not so well avoid the holes. Carriages were large and clumsy, rode on iron tires, and had no springs. They were so uncomfortable, however ornate, that most men and women preferred to travel on horseback, both sexes astride. Until the 12th century, the maintenance of roads depended upon the owner of the adjoining property, who wondered why he should spend to mend what chiefly transients used. In the 13th century, Frederick II, inspired by Moslem and Byzantine examples, ordered the repair of roads in Sicily and southern Italy, and about the same time the first royal highways were built in France, by laying stone cubes in a loose bed of earth or sand. In the same century, the cities began to pave their central streets. Florence, Paris, London, and the Flemish towns built excellent bridges. In the 12th century, the Church organized religious fraternities for the repair or construction of bridges, and offered indulgences to those who shared in the work. Such Frères Pontifes built the bridge at Avignon, which still preserves 4 arches from their hands. Some monastic orders, preeminently the Cistercians, toiled to keep roads and bridges functioning. From 1176 to 1209, king, clergy, and citizens contributed funds or labor to raising London Bridge. Houses and a chapel rose over it, and 20 stone arches carried it across the Thames. Early in the 13th century, the first known suspension bridge was thrown over a gorge in the St. Gothard Pass of the Alps. Roads being painful, waterways were popular and played the leading role in the transport of goods. One boat could carry as much as 500 animals, and far more cheaply. From the Tagus to the Volga, the rivers of Europe were its main highways, and their direction and outlets determined the spread of population, the growth of towns, and often national military policy. Canals were innumerable, though locks were unknown. Whether by boat or by land, travel was arduous and slow. A bishop took 29 days to go from Canterbury from the coal burned in the town below. And in 1301 London forbade the use of coal because smoke was poisoning the city. Medieval instances of a supposedly modern woe. Nevertheless, by the end of the 13th century, coal was actively mined at Newcastle and Durham, and elsewhere in England, Belgium, and France. The ownership of mineral deposits became a confusion of laws. When feudal tenure was strong, the lord claimed all mineral rights in his land and mined the deposits with his serfs. Ecclesiastical properties made similar claims and used serfs or hired miners to exhume valuable deposits from their land. Frederick Barbarossa decreed that the sovereign was sole proprietor of all minerals in the soil, and that these could be worked only by firms under state control. This reassumption of the regalian right, usual under the Roman emperors, became the law of medieval Germany. In England, the crown claimed all silver and gold deposits. Baser metals could be mined by the landowner on payment of a royalty to the king. Smelting was by charcoal and used up much wood in still primitive furnaces. Even so, the coppersmiths of Dinan produced fine brass wares. The ironworkers of Liège, Nuremberg, Milan, Barcelona, and Toledo made excellent arms and tools, and Seville was renowned for its steel. Toward the end of the 13th century, cast iron, fused at 1535 degrees centigrade, began to replace wrought iron, softened by 800 degrees centigrade. Nearly all previous ironworking had been by hammering, the smiting from which the smith derived his Saxon name. Bell founding was an important industry, for cathedrals and town belfries rivaled one another in the weight, sonority, and timbre of their bells. Coppersmiths made curfews, or couvre-feu, to cover hearth fires when curfew rang. Saxony was famous for its bronze founders, England for its pewter, a mixture of copper, bismuth, antimony, and tin. Wrought iron made elegant window gratings, majestic grills for cathedral choirs, and mighty hinges that spread in varied forms over doors for strength and ornament. Goldsmiths and silversmiths were numerous, for gold or silver plate served not only to display or disguise one's worth, but also to hedge a man against deflated currencies and to give him in emergency a form of wealth convertible into food or goods. In the 13th century, the textile industry in Flanders and Italy assumed a large-scale, semi-capitalist structure in which thousands of workers produced goods for the general market and earned profits for investors whom they seldom saw. In Florence, the Arte della Lana, or wool guild, had great factories, or fondachi, where washers, fullers, sorters, spinners, weavers, inspectors, and clerks worked under one roof, with materials, tools, and looms over which they had no ownership or control. Wholesale cloth merchants organized factories, provided equipment, secured labor and capital, fixed wages and prices, arranged distribution and sale, took the risks of enterprise, bore the losses of failure, and reaped the profits of success. Other employers preferred to farm out the raw material to individual workers or families who, with their own equipment, would turn it into finished products at home and would deliver these to the merchant for a wage or price. In this manner, thousands of men and women in Italy, Flanders, and France were brought into industrial occupations. Amiens, Beauvais, Lille, Laon, Saint-Quentin, Provins, Reims, Troyes, Cambrai, Tournai, Liège, Louvain, above all Ghent, Bruges, Ypres, and Douai, became whirlpools of such commission industry, famous for their artistry and their revolts. Laon gave its name to lawn, a linen, Cambrai to cambric, and the diaper pattern took its name from Ypres. At Ghent, 2,300 weavers worked at looms. Provins had 3,200 in the 13th century. A dozen Italian cities had their own textile industries. At Florence in the 12th century, the Arte della Lana specialized in the production of dyed woolen goods. Early in the 13th century, the Arte di Calimala, or cloth guild, organized an extensive business in the import of wool and the export of finished fabrics. By 1306, Florence had 3 factories, and by 1336, 30,000 textile workers. Genoa made fine velvets and gold-threaded silks. Toward the end of the 13th century, Vienna imported Flemish weavers, and soon had a flourishing textile industry of her own. England had almost a monopoly in northern Europe's production of wool. It sent most of its products to Flanders, and thereby bound that country to it in policy and war. The town of Worsted, in Norfolk, gave its name to a variety of woolen cloth. Spain also turned out fine wool. Her merino sheep were a main source of her national income. The Arabs had brought the culture and manufacture of silk to Spain in the 8th century, and to Sicily in the 9th. And Valencia, Cartagena, Seville, Lisbon, and Palermo continued the arts after becoming Christian. Roger II imported Greek and Jewish silk weavers from Corinth and Thebes into Palermo in 1147 and housed them in a palace. Through these men and their children, sericulture spread through Italy. Lucca organized the manufacture of silk on a capitalistic scale, rivaled by Florence, Milan, Genoa, Modena, Bologna, and Venice. The art crossed the Alps and developed skilled practitioners in Zurich, Paris, and Cologne. 100 other crafts rounded out the scope of medieval industry. Potters glazed earthenware vessels by powdering their moistened surface with lead and baking them in a gentle heat, adding copper or bronze to the lead if they wished a green instead of a yellow glaze. As buildings and fires became more costly in the growing cities of the 13th century, tiles replaced thatched roofs. London made the change mandatory in 1212. The building trades must have been competent, for some of the sturdiest structures existing in Europe date from this period. Industrial glass was made from mirrors, windows, and vessels, but on a relatively small scale. Cathedrals had the finest glass ever produced, but many houses had none. Glass blowing was practiced in Western Europe from at least the 11th century. Probably the art had never ceased in Italy from its heyday under the Roman Empire. Paper, till the 12th century, was imported from the Moslem East or Spain. But in 1190 a paper mill was opened at Ravensburg in Germany, and in the 13th century Europe began to make paper from linen. Hides were among the leading articles of international commerce, and tanning was universal. Glovers, saddlers, purse-makers, shoemakers, and cobblers were jealously distinct. Furs were brought in from north and east and were dressed for royalty, nobility, and bourgeoisie. Wine and beer served instead of central heating, and many towns profited by a municipal monopoly of brewing. The Germans already led the world in this ancient art, and Hamburg, with 500 breweries in the 14th century, owned most of its prosperity to its ale. Aside from textiles, industry remained in the handicraft stage. Workers serving a local market, bakers, cobblers, blacksmiths, carpenters, etc., controlled their own equipment and product and remained individually free. Most industry was still carried on in the homes of the workers or in shops attached to their homes, and most families performed for themselves many of the tasks now delegated to shops or factories, baked their bread, wove their clothing, mended their shoes. In this domestic industry progress was slow. Tools were simple, machines few. Motives of competition and profit did not stimulate men to invention or the replacement of human skill with mechanical power. And yet this may have been the most wholesome form of industrial organization in history. Its productivity was low, its degree of contentment was probably and relatively high. The worker remained near his family. He determined the hours and in some measure the price of his work. His pride in his skill gave him character and confidence. He was an artist as well as an artisan, and he had the artist's satisfaction of seeing an integral product taking form under his hands. 3. Money. The commercial and industrial expansion revolutionized finance. Commerce could not advance by barter. It required a stable standard of value, a convenient medium of exchange, and ready access to investment funds. Under continental feudalism, the great lords and prelates exercised the right of mintage, and European economy suffered from a bedlam of currencies worse than today's. Counterfeiters and coin clippers multiplied the chaos. The kings ordered such gentry to be dismembered or emasculated or boiled alive, but they themselves repeatedly debased their currencies. Gold became scarce after the barbarian invasions and disappeared from the coinages of Western Europe after the Moslem conquest of the East. Between the 8th and the 13th centuries, all such coinages were in silver or baser metals. Gold and civilization wax and wane together. In the Byzantine Empire, however, gold was coined throughout the Middle Ages. As contact between West and East grew, Byzantine gold coins, called byzants in the West, began to circulate through Europe as the most honored money in Christendom. In 1228, Frederick II, having observed the beneficent effect of a stable gold currency in the Near East, minted in Italy the first gold coins of Western Europe. He called them Augustales, in frank emulation of Augustan coins and prestige. They deserved the name, for though imitative, they were of noble design, and reached at once the highest level of medieval numismatic art. In 1252 both Genoa and Florence issued gold coins. The Florentine florin, equaling in value a pound of silver, was the more beautiful and viable, and was accepted throughout Europe. By 1284 all the major nations of Europe except England had a trustworthy gold coinage, an achievement sacrificed in the turmoil of the 20th century. By the end of the 13th century, the kings of France had bought up or confiscated nearly all seigneurial rights to the coining of money. The French monetary system kept till 1789 the terms, though hardly the values, established by Charlemagne: the livre, or pound of silver, the sou, or 20th part of a livre, and the denier, or 12th part of a sou. This system was brought to England by the Norman invasion. There, too, the pound sterling was divided into 20 parts, shillings, and each of these into 12 parts, pence. The English took the words pound, shilling, and penny from the German pfund, shilling, and pfennig, but took the signs for them from the Latin: the pound sign from libra, the S, an abbreviation for shilling, from solidus, and D, the abbreviation for pence, from denarius. England did not arrive at a gold currency till 1343. Her silver currency, however, as established by Henry II from 1154 to 1189, remained the most stable in Europe. In Germany, the silver mark was coined in the 10th century at half the value of the French or British pound. Despite these developments, medieval currencies suffered from fluctuations of value, the unsteady ratio of silver to gold, the power of the kings and cities, sometimes of nobles and ecclesiastics, to call in all coins at any time, charge a fee for reminting, and issue new coins debased with more alloy. Through the dishonesty of the mints, through the more rapid increase of gold than of goods, through the convenience of redeeming national debts in depreciated money, an irregular deterioration affected all European currencies through medieval and modern times. In France, the livre had in 1789 only 1.2% of its value under Charlemagne. We may judge the fall of money from some typical prices. At Ravenna in 1268 a dozen eggs cost a penny. At London in 1328 a pig cost 4 shillings, an oxen 15. In 13th century France, 3 francs bought a sheep, 6 a pig. History is inflationary. Where did the money come from that financed and expanded commerce and industry? The greatest single provider was the Church. She had an unparalleled organization for raising funds and always had a liquid capital available for any purpose. She was the greatest financial power in Christendom. Moreover, many individuals deposited private funds for safekeeping with churches or monasteries. From her wealth, the Church lent money to persons or institutions in difficulty. Loans were made chiefly to villagers seeking to improve their farms. They acted as land banks and played a beneficent role in promoting a free peasantry. As early as 1070, they lent money to neighboring lords in exchange for a share in the revenues of the lord's property. Through these mortgage loans, the monasteries became the first banking corporations of the Middle Ages. The Abbey of Saint-André in France did so flourishing a banking business that it hired Jewish moneylenders to manage its financial operations. The Knights Templar lent money on interest to kings and princes, lords and knights, churches and prelates. Their mortgage business was probably the largest in the world in the 13th century. But these loans by church bodies were usually for consumption or for political use, seldom for financing industry or trade. Commercial credit began when an individual or a family, by what Latin Christendom called commenda, commended or entrusted money to a merchant for a specific voyage or enterprise and received a share of the silent or sleeping partnership was an ancient Roman device, probably relearned by the Christian West from the Byzantine East. So useful a way of sharing in profits without directly contravening the ecclesiastical prohibition of interest was bound to spread, and the company, from companis, or bread-sharer, or family investment became a societas, a partnership in which several persons, not necessarily kin, financed a group or series of ventures rather than one. Such financial organizations appeared in Genoa and Venice toward the end of the 10th century, reached a high development in the 12th, and largely accounted for the rapid growth of Italian trade. These investment groups often distributed their risk by buying parts in several ships or ventures at a time. When in 14th century Genoa such shares, or partes, were made transferable, the joint stock company was born. The greatest single source of finance capital, that is, funds to meet the pre-income costs of an undertaking, was the professional financier. He had begun in antiquity as a money changer, and had long since developed into a money lender, investing his own and other people's money in enterprises or in loans to churches, monasteries, nobles, or kings. The role of the Jews as moneylenders has been exaggerated. They were powerful in Spain, and for a time in Britain, weak in Germany, outdone in Italy and France by Christian financiers. The chief lender to the kings of England was William Cade. The chief lenders in 13th century France and Flanders were the Louchard and Crespin families of Arras. William the Breton described Arras at that time as glutted with usurers. Another center of northern finance was the Bourse, from Bourse or purse, or money market of Bruges. A still more powerful group of Christian moneylenders originated in Cahors, a town of southern France. Matthew Paris writes, "In these days, 1235, the abominable plague of cohorsions raged so fiercely that there was scarcely any man in all England, especially among the prelates, who was not entangled in their nets. The king was indebted to them for an incalculable amount. They circumvented the indigent in their necessities, cloaking their usury under the pretense of trade." The papacy for a time entrusted its financial affairs in England to the cohorsion bankers, but their ruthlessness so offended the English that one of their number was murdered at Oxford. Bishop Roger of London pronounced an anathema upon them, and Henry III banished them from England. Robert Grosseteste, Bishop of Lincoln, lamented on his deathbed the extortions of the merchants and exchangers of our Lord the Pope, who are harder than the Jews. It was the Italians who developed banking to unprecedented heights in the 13th century. Great banking families rose to supply the sinews of far-reaching Italian trade. The Buonsignori and Gallerani in Siena, the Frescobaldi, Bardi, and Peruzzi in Florence, the Pisani and Tiepoli in Venice. They extended their operations beyond the Alps and lent great sums to the ever-needy kings of England and France, to barons, bishops, abbots, and towns. Popes and kings employed them to collect revenues, manage mints and finances, advise on policy. They bought wool, spices, jewelry, and silk wholesale, and owned ships and hotels from one end of Europe to the other. By the middle of the 13th century, these Lombards, as the North called all Italian bankers, were the most active and powerful financiers in the world. They were hated at home and abroad for their exactions, and were envied for their wealth. Every generation borrows and denounces those who lend. Their rise dealt a heavy blow to Jewish international banking, and they were not above recommending the banishment of these patient competitors. The strongest of the Lombards were the Florentine banking firms, of whom 80 are recorded between 1260 and 1347. They financed the political and military campaigns of the papacy and reaped rich rewards, and their position as papal bankers provided a useful cover in operations that were hardly in harmony with the views of the Church on interest. They made profits worthy of modern times. The Peruzzi, for example, paid a 40% dividend in 1308. But these Italian firms almost atoned for their greed by their vitalizing services to commerce and industry. When their tide ebbed, they left some of their terms, banco, credito, debito, cassa, or money box, cash, conto, disconto, conto corrente, netto, bilanza, bancarotta, bank broken or bankruptcy, in almost all European languages. As these words suggest, the great money firms of Venice, Florence, and Genoa, in or before the 13th century, developed nearly all the functions of a modern bank. They accepted deposits and carried current accounts, between parties having an unfinished series of money transactions. As early as 1171, the Bank of Venice arranged exchanges of accounts among its clients by mere bookkeeping operations. They made loans, and as security they accepted jewelry, costly armor, government bonds, or the right to collect taxes or manage the public revenue. They received goods in bond for transfer to other countries. Through their international connections, they were able to issue letters of credit by which a deposit made in one country would be returned to the depositor or his appointee in another country, a device long known to the Jews, the Moslems, and the Templars. Conversely, they wrote bills of exchange. A merchant, in return for goods or a loan, gave a promissory note to pay the creditor at one of the great fairs or international banks by a stated time. These notes were balanced against one another at fair or bank, and only the final balance was paid in money. Hundreds of transactions could now take place without the nuisance of carrying or exchanging great sums and weights of coin. As the banking centers became clearing-houses, the bankers avoided the long journey to the fairs. Merchants throughout Europe and the Levant could draw on their accounts in the banks of Italy and have their balances settled by interbank bookkeeping. In effect, the utility and circulation of money were increased tenfold. This credit system, made possible by mutual trust, was not the least important or honorable aspect of the economic revolution. Insurance, too, had its beginnings in the 13th century. The merchant guilds gave their members insurance against fire, shipwreck, and other misfortunes or injuries, even against lawsuits incurred for crimes, whether the members were guilty or innocent. Many monasteries offered a life annuity. In return for a sum of money paid down, they promised to provide the donor with food and drink, sometimes also with clothes and lodging for the rest of his life. As early as the 12th century, a Bruges banking house offered insurance on goods, and a chartered insurance company was apparently established there in 1310. The Bardi of Florence in 1318 accepted insurance risks on overland assignments of cloth. The first government bonds were issued by Venice in 1157. The needs of war led the Republic to exact forced loans from the citizens, and a special department, Camera degli Imprestiti, was set up to receive the loans and give the subscribers interest-bearing certificates as state guarantees of repayment. After 1206, these government bonds were made negotiable and transferable. They could be bought or sold or used as security for loans. Similar certificates of municipal indebtedness were accepted at Como in 1250 as equivalent to metal currency. Since paper money is merely a governmental promise to pay, these negotiable gold certificates marked the beginning of paper money in Europe. The complicated operations of the bankers, the papacy, and the monarchies required a careful system of bookkeeping. Archives and account books swelled with records of rents, taxes, receipts, expenditures, credits, and debts. The accounting methods of imperial Rome, lost in Western Europe in the 7th century, continued in Constantinople, were adopted by the Arabs, and were revived in Italy during the Crusades. A fully developed system of double-entry bookkeeping appears in the communal accounts of Genoa in 1340. The loss of Genoese records for the years from 1278 to 1340 leaves open the probability that this advance was also an achievement of the 13th century. 4. Interest. The greatest obstacle to the development of banking was the ecclesiastical doctrine of interest. This had three sources: Aristotle's condemnation of interest as an unnatural breeding of money by money, Christ's condemnation of interest, and the reaction of the fathers of the Church against commercialism and usury in Rome. Roman law had legalized interest, and honorable men, like Brutus, had charged merciless rates. Ambrose had denounced the theory that one may do what he likes with his own. "My own, say you? What is your own? When you came from your mother's womb, what wealth did you bring with you? That which is taken by you beyond what suffices you is taken by violence. Is it that God is unjust in not distributing the means of life to us equally, so that you should have abundance while others are in want? Or is it not rather that he wished to confer upon you marks of his kindness, while he crowned your fellow-man with the virtue of patience? You, then, who have received the gift of God, think you that you commit no injustice by keeping to yourself alone what would be the means of life to many? It is the bread of the hungry you cling to, it is the clothing of the naked you lock up, the money you bury is the redemption of the poor." Other church fathers had verged upon communism. "The use of all that is in the world," said Clement of Alexandria, "ought to be common to all men. But by injustice one man has called this his own, another that, and so has come division among men." Jerome held all profit unjust. Augustine considered all business an evil, as turning men from seeking true rest, which is God. Pope Leo I had rejected these extreme doctrines, but the mood of the Church continued unsympathetic to commerce, suspicious of all speculation and profit, hostile to all engrossing, forestalling, and usury, by which last term the Middle Ages meant any interest charge whatever. Usury, said Ambrose, is whatever is added to the capital, and Gratian embodied this blunt definition in the canon law of the Church. The councils of Nicaea in 325, Orléans in 538, Macon in 585, and Clichy in 626 had forbidden the clergy to lend money for gain. The capitularies of Charlemagne for 789 and the church councils of the 9th century extended the prohibition to laymen. The revival of Roman law in the 12th century emboldened Irnerius and the glossators of Bologna to defend interest, and they were able to quote Justinian's code in its behalf. But the Third Council of the Lateran in 1179 renewed the prohibition and decreed that manifest usurers shall not be admitted to communion, nor, if they die in sin, to Christian burial, and no priest shall accept their alms. Innocent III must have taken a more lenient view, for in 1206 he advised that in certain cases a dowry should be committed to some merchant, so that an income might be derived from it by honest gain. Gregory IX, however, returned to the conception of usury as any receipt of any profit on a loan. and this remained the law of the Roman Church till 1917. The wealth of the Church was in land, not in trade. She scorned merchants as the feudal barons scorned them. Land and labor, including management, seemed to her the only true creators of wealth and value. She resented the rising power and opulence of a mercantile class not too well disposed to feudal landowners or to the Church. She had for centuries thought of all moneylenders as Jews, and she felt justified in rebuking the hard terms exacted by moneylenders from needy ecclesiastical institutions. By and large, the effort of the Church to control the profit motive was an heroic assertion of Christian morality. It formed a wholesome contrast to the imprisonment or enslavement of debtors that had disgraced Greek, Roman, and barbarian life and law. We cannot be sure that men are happier today than they would have been had the view of the Church prevailed. For a long time, the legislation of governments supported the position of the Church, and the prohibition of interest was enforced in the secular courts. But commercial necessity proved stronger than fear of prison or hell. The expansion of trade and industry demanded the use of idle money by active enterprise. States at war or in other emergencies found it easier to borrow than to tax. Guilds both lent and borrowed at interest. Landowners, extending their property or leaving for crusades, welcomed the moneylender. Churches themselves and monasteries survived their crises or rising costs or needs by recourse to the Lombards, the Cahorsians, or the Jews. Wits of men found many subterfuges from the law. A borrower would sell land cheap to the lender, leave him the usufruct as interest, and later repurchase the land. Or the landowner sold to the lender some or all of the annual rents or revenues of his land. If, for example, A sold to B for $100, the rents of a parcel yielding $10 a year, B was in effect lending A $100 at 10%. Many monasteries invested their funds by buying such rent charges, above all in Germany, where the word for interest, Zins, grew out of the medieval Latin for rents, census. Towns borrowed money by deeding to the lender a share in their revenues. Individuals and institutions, including monasteries, lent money in return for secret gifts or fictitious sales. Pope Alexander III complained in 1163 that many of the clergy, chiefly monastic, while they shrink from common usury as from a thing too plainly condemned, do, notwithstanding, lend money to others who are in need, take their possessions in pledge, and receive the fruits therefrom accruing beyond the principal lent. Some borrowers pledged themselves to pay damages, increasing for every day or month of delay in repaying a loan, and the date of payment was placed so early as to make such concealed interest inevitable. On this basis, the Cahorsians lent money to certain monasteries on terms equivalent to 60% per year. Many banking firms openly lent at interest and claimed immunity on the theory that the law applied only to individuals. The cities of Italy made no excuses for paying interest on their government bonds. In 1208, Innocent III remarked that if all usurers were excluded from the Church as canon law demanded, all churches might as well be closed. The Church reluctantly adjusted herself to realities. St. Thomas Aquinas, about 1250, courageously formulated a new ecclesiastical doctrine of interest. The investor in a business enterprise might legitimately share in the gain if he actually shared in the risk or the loss, and loss was interpreted to include any delay in the repayment of the loan beyond a stipulated date. St. Bonaventura and Pope Innocent IV accepted the principle and widened it to legitimize a payment made to a lender in return for the temporary loss of the use of his capital. Some 15th-century canonists admitted the right of states to issue interest-bearing bonds. Pope Martin V in 1425 legalized the sale of rent charges. After 1400, most European states repealed their laws against interest, and the Church prohibition survived as a dead letter which all agreed to ignore. The Church tried to find a solution by encouraging St. Bernardino of Feltre and other ecclesiastics in establishing, from 1251 on, Montes Pietatis, hills of love, where trustworthy persons in need, by depositing some article as a pledge, might obtain loans without interest. But these precursors of our pawnbrokers' shops touched only a small sector of the problem. The needs of commerce and industry remained, and capital rose to meet them. The professional moneylenders exacted high rates of interest not so much because they were conscienceless devils as because they ran great risks of loss and head. They could not always enforce their contracts through appeals to the law. Their accumulations were subject to requisition by kings or emperors. They could at any moment be banished, and were at all times damned. Many loans were never repaid. Many borrowers died bankrupt. Some went on crusades, were excused from paying interest, and never returned. When borrowers defaulted, the lenders could only make up the loss by raising rates on other loans. The good loan had to pay for the bad one, as the price of commodities bought must include the cost of commodities spoiled before sale. In 12th century France and England, the interest rate ranged between 33 1/3% and 43 1/3%. Sometimes it rose to 86%. In prosperous Italy, it sank to 12.5% to 20%. Frederick II, about 1240, tried to lower the rate to 10%, but soon paid more than that to Christian moneylenders. As late as 1409, the government of Naples allowed 40% as the legal maximum. The interest rate fell as the security of loans rose, and as the competition of lenders increased. Gradually, through 1,000 experiments and errors, men learned to use the new financial tools of a progressive economy, and the age of money began in the age of faith. 5. The Guilds. In ancient Rome there were countless collegia, scholae, sodalitates, artes, associations of artisans, merchants, contractors, political clubs, secret fraternities, religious brotherhoods. Did any of these survive to beget the medieval guilds? 2 letters of Gregory I, 590 to 604, refer to a corporation of soap makers at Naples and to another of bakers at Otranto. In the law code of the Lombard king Rotharis, from 636 to 652, we read of magistri comacini, apparently master masons from Como, who speak of one another as collegantes, colleagues of the same collegium. Associations of transport workers are mentioned in 7th century Rome and in 10th century Worms. The ancient guilds continued in the Byzantine Empire. In Ravenna we find references to many scholae, or economic associations, in the 6th century to bakers, in the 9th to notaries and merchants, in the 10th to fishermen, in the 11th to victuallers. We hear of artisan ministeria in 9th century Venice, of a gardener's scola in 11th century Rome. Doubtless most of the ancient guilds in the West succumbed to the barbarian invasions and the resulting re-ruralization and poverty, but some seem to have survived in Lombardy. When commerce and industry recovered in the 11th century, the conditions that had begotten the collegia regenerated the guilds. Consequently, these were strongest in Italy, where the old Roman institutions were best preserved. In Florence, in the 12th century, we find arti, arts, craft unions, of notaries, clothiers, wool merchants, bankers, physicians, and druggists, mercers or silk dealers, furriers, tanners, armorers, innkeepers. These guilds were apparently modeled on those of Constantinople. North of the Alps, the destruction of the ancient collegia was presumably more complete than in Italy, yet we find them mentioned in the laws of Dagobert I in 630, the capitularies of Charlemagne in 779 and 789, and the ordinances of Archbishop Hincmar of Reims in 852. In the 11th century, the guilds reappear in France and Flanders, and multiply rapidly as charité, frérie, or brotherhoods, or compagnies. In Germany, the guilds, or Hanse, stemmed from old Markgenossenschaften, local associations for mutual aid, religious observances, and holiday hilarity. By the 12th century, many of these had become trade or craft unions, and by the 13th century, these were so strong that they contested political as well as economic authority with the municipal councils. The Hanseatic League was such a guild. The first mention of English guilds is in the laws of King Inna, 688 to 726, which speak of gegilden, associates who helped one another to pay any wergild assessed against them. The Anglo-Saxon word gild, G-I-L-D, compare with the German Geld, the English gold, and yield, meant a contribution to a common fund, and later the society that administered the fund. The oldest reference to English trade guilds is dated 1093. By the 13th century, nearly every important town in England had one or more guilds, and a kind of municipal guild socialism held sway in England and Germany. Nearly all the guilds of the 11th century were merchant guilds. They included only independent merchants and master workmen. They excluded all persons dependent upon others. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.